Hello YouTube. I already told you in my previous videos about fascinating Soviet inventions, such as invisible aircraft and the early type of what we call today the internet. Of course, some never made it to the production line. This was not due to the fact of the fault of the inventors. I'll tell you today about more fascinating inventions and projects, what transpired, and actually what can still happen. I also want to demonstrate to you that people and reality of the country called Russia you see in Hollywood movies is not what it is not what semi-literate Tinseltown producers projected to be. Unfortunately, my country was subjected to the ideological control of the idiotic socialist ideas for over 70 years, and a number of the same Hollywood producers eagerly share and applaud such ideas, while at the same time, in their sheer ignorance, they belittle the Russian people, culture and customs, and consistently depict Russians as thugs, prostitutes, drunks, and organized criminals. Well, let me tell you about the inventions. Virtually all Soviet science and technology was military. There was little specifically civilian technology to speak about. Scientific and technological progress was hindered by the stagnation of the planned economy, at best focused on the current needs of the people, but not able to foresee the future. This is confirmed by the history of the Soviet radio phone LK-1, which was actually the first mobile phone in the world. Telephone radio apparatus, this is how it was called. Soviet engineer Leonid Kupriyanovich, who graduated from the famous Moscow State Bauman University, most likely worked at one of the classified top-secret enterprises, since the place of his work was not named in the media articles. Kupriyanovich began working on portable radio stations back in the mid-1950s and quickly achieved impressive success. The engineer filed a patent application for registration of a device for calling and switching radio-telephone communication channels. The LK-1 device he invented made it possible to communicate with the city telephone network by means of electromagnetic waves. Kupriyanovich demonstrated the first prototype of the device, weighing 3 kilograms, in 1957. At the same time, articles were published in the Soviet magazines Science and Life and Behind the Wheel, with photos of the outlandish telephone radio equipment. The size of Kupriyanovich's telephone resembled thick volume of an encyclopedia. The technical parameters of the device allowed the user to move away from the automatic telephone radio station to a distance of 20 to 30 kilometers and not change the batteries during the day. If necessary, a car battery could be used to power the LK-1. There are 2 antennas on the device. On its front panel, there are 4 call switches, a microphone, outside of which headphones are connected, and a dial disc. That's how the inventor described the appearance of his device. The following year, Leonid Kupriyanovich created a pocket radio phone that weighed only 500 grams. This, of course, is 6 times more than the average weight of a modern mobile phone, but at that time, such compactness was on the verge of fiction. For comparison, we can mention the first commercial cell phone Dynatec 8000X, released in 1983 by the American company Motorola. Its weight was 783 grams. Kupriyanovich compared the size of the 1958 model to the dimensions of 2 cigarette boxes stacked together. According to this model, it was already possible to call without headphones and a microphone. They were replaced by an ordinary handset. A significant amount of space on the device was occupied by the same dial disc. Finally, in 1961, the Soviet electronics genius demonstrated to the journalist of the Novosti Press agency the latest and the most advanced model of his radio phone. It weighed only 70 grams and fit in the palm of your hand. There were still no buttons on the device, but the dial disc was reduced several times. Other characteristics were also unique. For example, the device could move away from the base station for as much as 80 kilometers. This meant that the owner of the radio phone was free to move within Moscow. The creator of the first mobile phone and the amateur radio enthusiasts who followed its publications expected that over time there would be thousands of LK1 radio phones. They were planned to be used not only in industry but also in everyday life for personal use. In 1957, the Soviet magazine Young Technician published a cartoon, the hero which calls on a radio phone with a propeller from Moscow to Paris. And the device of 1961, according to Soviet newspapers, was ready for serial production. However, these hopes were too bright. In the era of the space race, an invention designed to make life easier for an ordinary Soviet person turned out to be virtually useless. Listen, I remember the saying we had at the time in the Soviet Union. They, meaning the Soviet rulers, can build spaceships, but cannot produce or manufacture everyday irons that people could use for ironing clothes. Basically, we had no consumer goods, of quality goods to speak of, or I would say basic goods too. Our leaders, those dedicated servants of the people, the Communist Party nomenclatura, successfully used the Altai communication system, similar to a standard telephone, only installed in a car. Why let ordinary people possess the means of uncontrolled communications? So that they would question the wisdom of Politburo? Everyone forgot about Leonid Kupryanovich radio phone, and he himself refused to develop further in this area. The inventor died in 1994, just when the first imported cell phones, which cost tons of money, were already appearing on the Russian market. But there was a different country at that time. Young Russians today do not know what socialism was and what planned economy did to the largest country in the world. It seems to me that the American youth is not very bright in this regard too. Anyway, there was another inventor in the USSR whose life definitely deserves a motion picture, who was not as fortunate as Kupryanovich. To this day, historians argue about whether Vladimir Bekauri was a genius or just a brilliant hoaxer. In favor of the former, we can say that Bekauri really invented a remote mine and even intended to make this entire domestic army controlled from a distance. But the opponents of this story cite as evidence the huge sums that the authorities allocated for the research of Bekauri, as well as the fact that while under arrest, the inventor himself confessed that he was just fooling everyone's minds. But please remember that the Soviet secret police, when they tortured people and interrogated them, knew how to make sure that they say what needs to be said. Anyway, he was the master of safe deposit boxes, Vladimir Ivanovich Bekauri. He was almost the same age as Joseph Stalin and was also his countryman. Born in Georgia, Russian Empire. Bekauri was born in 1882 in Tiflis province. His father was a peasant, but had a certificate of nobility. According to some historians, the document was fake. In Tiflis, Bekauri Jr. graduated from the railway school and after 2 years moved to a permanent place of residence in St. Petersburg. There he took up his favorite business, inventing. It should be noted that Vladimir Ivanovich had already repeatedly become the author of various innovations, in particular concerning the railway. In St. Petersburg, Bekauri took up with the safes. He designed and manufactured an electrical alarm system for the safes. Now, Soviet dictator Vladimir Lenin accidentally found out about the work of the Georgian master and invited Bekauri to his house. Lenin was very interested in reliable safes for storing particularly important and secret documents. When the project for the communist leader was finished, Vladimir Ivanovich told his namesake that he could make a mine that would be controlled from a distance. So Bekauri almost instantly became a prominent scientist. And such a rise was only possible for a real genius or a real fraudster. A few months later, in 1921, by government decree, a special technical bureau, Ostechbureau, was organized, and Vladimir Bekauri became the head of that bureau. This enterprise had more than 500 employees in its heyday, a huge figure for those times. In the Ostechbureau, money flowed like river. For example, once the authorities allocated 150,000 francs to the bureau for the next development. This was an astronomical sum in those years. Bekauri went on business trips to capitalist countries, lived in a mansion in the center of Moscow, and had many government awards and orders. Bekauri also played into the hands of the fact that Soviet Marshal Tukhachevsky was also interested in remote tanks at that very moment. Without the support of Mikhail Nikolaevich Tukhachevsky, even a brilliant inventor would not be able to do his work. And Bekauri received his support. One of the successful projects, and according to some historians, the only one, was a remote mine called Bemi. The name of the landmine was made up of two initial letters of the names of its inventors, Bekauri and Mitkevich. However, opponents of Vladimir Ivanovich tend to believe that in this case the credit should be fully given only to Mitkevich. In any case, the tests were successful, and soon the Bemi entered mass production. Bekauri dreamed of creating a whole remote army, from machine guns and landmines to airplanes and submarines. For the Ostechbureau, the authorities bought a lot of different equipment abroad and allocated entire airfields for testing inventions. In the 1930s, under the leadership of Vladimir Ivanovich, the so-called teletanks, that is, remote control tanks, were born. In addition, work was carried out on the creation of radio-controlled pillboxes, aircraft, and even submarines. However, all these projects remained unfinished, at least during Bekauri's lifetime. As the Stalin's purges raged on, Marshal Tukhachevsky was executed in 1937 and Bekauri in 1938. Vladimir Ivanovich was accused of sabotage and espionage in favor of Nazi Germany. Well, in 1956, he was rehabilitated, meaning his name was restored. But the ideas of remote control weapons are, of course, alive and well around the globe. Now let's look at nuclear energy. Pamir 63090. This is how the USSR created the world's only nuclear power plant on wheels. Many of the achievements of the post-war Soviet Union in the field of nuclear energy have not yet been surpassed even by advanced countries. One of the most unique developments of Soviet scientists was the mobile nuclear power plant Pamir 63090 or 630D, designed to work in the conditions of the far north of the country. In the 1950s, the idea of transported nuclear power plants, as they say, was up in the air. If nuclear reactors can be installed on nuclear-powered ships and submarines, why not move them on land? It is not surprising that the idea proposed by scientists to put the nuclear power plant on wheels inspired the Ministry of Intermediate Machine Building, and the minister was Yefim Slavsky. This would allow the Soviet Union to provide cheap electricity and heat to the residents of remote areas of the far north and the far east. For settlements and military bases located in the Arctic, at that time, millions of tons of fuel had to be imported annually. According to the authors of the Encyclopedia Mechanical Engineering, the development of mobile nuclear installations of the first generation was conducted in the 1950s and 1960s. On the basis of the water reactor, the TPP-3 station was created, which was installed on the chassis of the T-10 tank. Other mobile installations of that period included Arbuz, meaning Antarctic block installation, as well as VK-50, still operating in Dimitrovgrad. The second generation of portable nuclear power plants includes the Sever 2 and Volnolom 3 installations built in the 1970s. And in 1981, the Kurchatov Institute put into operation a pilot demonstration thermoelectric installation Gamma, which worked for almost 20 years. The accumulated experience was useful to the designers of the mobile nuclear power plant Pamir 630D. Work on it was carried out at the Institute of Nuclear Energy of the Academy of Sciences of the Belarusian SSR in 1976-1985. Well, in the early 1980s, two prototypes were built, representing at that time the only nuclear power plants on wheels in the world. Externally, Pamir 630D nuclear power plant was a complex of two multi-ton semi-trailers attached to a MAZ 796 military track tractors. A 630 kW reactor and turbojet units were located behind strong metal walls. The other two cars or vehicles were equipped with control computers, minks, and compartments for personnel, designed for 28 people. All-terrain vehicles could deliver the Pamir 630D to any point in the far north across the tundra and the swampy terrain. The nuclear power plant was ready to operate at the lowest ambient temperatures. The creators of Pamir implemented the most compact single-circuit scheme of a nuclear installation. Unlike most other small nuclear power plants, general designer Vasily Nesterenko proposed as a heat carrier not water and water vapor, but a dissociating gas nitrine based on nitrogen tetraoxide, which was characterized by increased thermal conductivity and heat capacity. According to the idea of the designers of the mobile nuclear power plant, it could work continuously for 2,000 hours. As a result, one of the two Pamirs worked 3,000 hours, however at lower power than was laid down in the project. The reserve of nuclear fuel would be enough for several more years of work. By the beginning of Gorbachev's policies of perestroika, the Soviet government assumed that low-power nuclear plants would eventually provide heat and electricity to about 33 settlements in the far north. However, the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant led to the elimination of government-approved programs for the development of small-scale energy. It is worth noting that Pamir 630D did not pose almost any danger. The developers laid down 3 stages of safety in the installation. And first of all, to eliminate the human factor, the work of the mobile nuclear power plant was extremely automated. However, the mobile nuclear installation was tested only 6 kilometers from Minsk. That's in Belarus. Well, for Belarusians who had just experienced the consequences of the Chernobyl, maybe worse than anybody else, it was psychologically uncomfortable. In February 1988, the State Commission decided to stop testing the Pamir. The projects of new mobile nuclear installations proposed by Russian scientists in the early 1990s remained only on paper. The country no longer had the funds to implement them. Interest in small nuclear power plants was revived abroad, that is not in Russia, in the 21st century. It is possible that the experiences of the designers of Pamir 630D will still be useful to Russia, especially in the conditions when the country's presence in the Arctic is becoming increasingly strategic and geopolitical. Russia is not going to lose its presence in the Arctic and its territorial claims to the immense natural resources. Look at my videos about the Arctic, about the paranormal phenomena there, and I share updates about Russia's developments and growth of its formidable military presence there. They realize the challenges facing them in the area in the coming years. Now let's talk about a folding helicopter and why it was created in the USSR. Well, who, as a child or young person, did not dream of a personal helicopter? Preferably not a very large, something that could be stored in a shed or a garage, or better yet on the balcony. I know many people who were not too young who would dream about it in the Soviet Union. You could use it to try to fly over the border and defect. Anyway, in the 1970s, such a dream might well have become a reality. Of course, the mini helicopter developed in the USSR was intended not for the childish fun or the affection, but for the needs of the country's intelligence services. I'm speaking here about the Kamov air motorcycles. The peak of interest in light and ultralight helicopters was in the 1940s, 1950s. In the USSR, the designer Nikolai Kamov was engaged in inventing such devices. It was he who coined the term vertolyot, or helicopter in Russian. In 1948, Kamov created the first Soviet single-seat Ka-8 helicopter with a light motorcycle engine of 27 horsepower, rotating two coaxial propellers. For its compact size and low-power engine, the aircraft received the nickname Air Motorcycle. The development turned out to be very successful, and on its basis, the Ka-10 and Ka-15 helicopters were created, used for the needs of the maritime intelligence and communications. The coaxial design with two screws of multi-directional rotation proved to be very reliable and convenient. This solution made it possible to make the helicopter more compact by eliminating the tail rotor. In addition, the maneuverability of the aircraft and the convenience of controlling it increased. It is not surprising that in 1971, the development of an ultralight single-seat helicopter for the needs of the intelligence services was entrusted to Kamov Design Bureau. According to the technical specification, the device was supposed to be not only light and compact, but also collapsible. Moreover, in disassembled form, it should fit into a cylindrical container with a diameter of up to half a meter. It was planned that the assembly will be carried out only by one person and will take no more than 15 minutes. Important attention was paid to the autonomy of the helicopter and the possibility of its long-term operation away from airfields and stationary bases. At that time, the task was quite difficult because nothing like this existed in the world. The Ka-10 was taken as the basis for the new Ka-56 ASA or WASP project. The layout and location of the pilot, the scheme with coaxial propellers, the air-cooled rotary piston engine running on automobile fuel. A full-scale prototype with folding nodes and elements was created. During tests, it turned out that the device can be brought into flight readiness in just 10 minutes by one person. But there were no flights. As Nikolai Kamov himself noted in the working documents, there was no low-power compact engine suitable for the device in the USSR. The work was first suspended until better times, that is, until the appearance of such an engine, and then completely abandoned. The Design Bureau had new goals and tasks. Nevertheless, the helicopter, which had every chance to become an assistant to Soviet intelligence agents and saboteurs, it still appeared. However, many years later, and already in another country. In 2016, Gyroplane introduced the Micron folding helicopter, which is very similar in layout, design, and characteristics to the ASA. The creators, according to the Russian media, do not hide the fact that they focused on the developments of Kamov. With a weight of 115 kilograms, the device rises to a height of about 3,000 meters and develops a speed of 120 kilometers an hour, while it is able to transport even cargo that exceeds its own weight. The Micron is powered by ordinary gasoline. Okay, now let's look at outer space. Well, the rapid stage of the development of the Soviet space program took place in the 1950s-1960s. It was then that the Soviet Union first launched a satellite into space and then carried out the first human flight beyond the Earth's atmosphere. But even before that, our country began to conduct large-scale work on space exploration. The development of the rocket industry in the USSR began immediately after the end of World War II. In the fall of 1945, engineers Mikhail Tikhomirov and Nikolai Chernyshov began developing the BP-190 stratospheric rocket at the Research Institute number 4 of Rocket Technology of the Academy of Artillery Sciences. It was made on the basis of the German V-2 ballistic missile, and the Soviet development was supposed to provide a vertical flight of 2 pilots to an altitude of up to 200 kilometers. The project was called Победа, Victory. With the help of the project, it was supposed to study the conditions of weightlessness in a short-term free flight of a person in a sealed cabin, as well as to obtain data on the upper layers of the atmosphere. For this purpose, Tikhomirov and Chernyshov proposed solutions that have found application in modern spacecraft: a parachute descent system, a soft landing brake rocket engine, a separation system with the use of pyrobolts, an electric contact rod for the anticipatory ignition of the soft landing engine, a catapult-less hermetic cabin with a life support system. In addition to the scientific and technical importance, the project, in our opinion, contains elements of great political and social significance, the timely implementation of which will allow our motherland to write the pages of glory and immortality in the annals of the history of civilization. The above, due to the exceptional prospects that are the result of the further development of the project, which we have already thought out, makes us, Comrade Stalin, turn to you with a request for help in launching works aimed at increasing the glory of our motherland and expanding the horizons of science. The scientist noted in a letter to Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. Well, Stalin, as well as the president of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR, Sergei Vavilov, approved the project. To practice the safe descent of the detachable head part with the instruments, the Institute approved the research topic rocket probe, which was positively evaluated by the father of the Soviet space program, Sergei Korolev. It was his design office that took over the work on the implementation of the BP-190 project after a while, and Mikhail Tikhomirov and Nikolai Chernyshov no longer participated in it. Well, development of the project under the leadership of Korolev in the design bureau in his name within the framework of the BP-190 project began to create high-altitude missiles with hermetic head parts, with a life support system, an emergency rescue system, and a flight performance. To test the effectiveness of these missiles, they first decided to use animals to assess the impact on them of those factors that would affect human beings during flight. The first animals in history to make a successful suborbital space flight were the dogs Kesik and Tsigan, and this happened on July 22nd of 1951. In total, from 51 to 1957, 3 series of dog flights were conducted at the Kapustin Yar training ground in the Astrakhan region. In 1951, it was on R-1B and R missiles, and in 1954-1957 on R-1D and R-1E missiles. In 1957-1960 on R-2A and R-5A missiles. However, the project never reached the stage of human flights and was considered unpromising due to the work on the creation of the orbital manned spacecraft satellite Vostok. The project itself was strictly classified, that rocket project, and the designers, scientists, and even dogs were given pseudonyms. For the first time, information about the development of the project and the first flights of dogs on rockets was officially disclosed only in 1991. Okay? Now let's look at another project of a very promising space fighter jet, you should say. I don't know if you can call it jet, and its fate. Russian people who remember the beginning of the space age in the USSR often wondered, what is the fate of cosmonaut number 2, German Titov, Gagarin's understudy? His name quickly disappeared from the lists of the cosmonaut squad or detachment, and as always in such cases, rumors began to spread that he had suffered a bad flight and was expelled by the medical board. And then, many years later, it was officially announced that General Titov was dealing with the problems of deep space communications. In reality, this was not the case. Having left, like Gagarin, the prescribed honorary tours for cosmonaut heroes around the country and abroad, Titov entered the Zhukovsky Academy. It's a very special, secretive place of higher learning in the USSR and now in Russia for the future GRU officers, cosmonauts, space scientists, and modern UFO hunters. Back then, at the Academy, at the very special course, he learned that in the Aircraft Design Bureau of Mikoyan, they're working on a fundamentally new spacecraft, a reusable space fighter. It was under this Spiral project. During his studies at the Academy, Titov realized, although there was no official ban, that he had very little chance of flying into space again as part of the manned flight program. In addition, there is a large queue of those who have not yet flown into outer space, Soviet cosmonauts, and the role of potential wedding general, so to say, or figurehead, did not suit him. Now, he had another chance to be the first space fighter pilot. And so he went from the cosmonaut detachment to the Mikoyan Design Bureau. And although, as Titov recalls, Mikoyan met him without much joy, well, he passed the first stage to the intended goal. He became the first in the list of future pilots of the space fighter, in a group that initially consisted of 3 people, Titov, Filipchenko, and Kuklin. In Lipetsk, they received theoretical training, and then in 1967, in the famous Vladimirovka, they began to master the test work of the aircraft. As the work on the Spiral unfolded, the so-called 4th Department was created in Star City, which included young pilots Kizim, Romanenko, Janibekov, Malyshev, and others. All well-known names. Almost all of them flew into space, but only they did it according to the usual space program. The designer of the reusable space fighter in the Mikoyan Design Bureau was Lazino Lazinsky, who would later become one of the key figures among the developers of the Buran shuttle. The American shuttle was not even in the project stage at that time, and as for the Buran, I will describe this Soviet shuttle and its strange, uncanny fate, but in another video. But then, in the middle 1960s, Buran was not in the project, and this small single-seat wingless space plane that they worked in the design bureau, it was called Bor, with indexes 1, 2, 3, and 4. There were several modifications, one of them resembling an ordinary MiG-17, only with shortened wings and a ski-shaped fuselage, was suspended from the carrier aircraft, then dropped from a high altitude and went to land without an engine. Another modification, completely wingless and most similar to the Russian so-called Bast shoe, Lapot, with triangular stabilizer in the stern, was lifted by a carrier rocket. The same one that Titov flew on was into outer space, and from there spiraled to Earth, landing in the Pacific Ocean. Initially, the Ministry of Defense showed great interest in the Spiral project, since its main advantage was a space-free launch from almost anywhere in the USSR. All 3 cosmodromes or spaceports, Baikonur, Plesetsk, Kapustin Yar, all the names you can see in my videos about UFOs and their visits to military installations. Anyway, all these spaceports were in the sights of the likely enemy's combat missiles, and so were the missile silos. The space fighter, together with the upper stage, was supposed to launch into the space from the back of the carrier aircraft from any airfield adopted for takeoff, and then land on the airfield as well. Landing on water was a temporary option. But in 1967, the new Minister of Defense, Grechko, cut the project. Too small, only 6 meter longs, and it seemed to be too frivolous to have this space plane. By that time, the country's leadership had received espionage information about the development in the United States of the ideas of reusable spacecraft, and the developers of Soviet space technology were made to understand that it was impossible to lag behind the Americans. So instead of Bohr, designer Lazino Lozinsky was forced to switch to the development of the Buran. However, something happened that was only possible under the Soviet system. The designer continued to work on the Bohr without funding from the Ministry of Defense. As they say, on a voluntary basis. Of course, the main role was played because he had a solid protection in the person of the chief designer of the design bureau, Artyom Ivanovich Mikoyan. His brother, Anastas Ivanovich Mikoyan, was in those years actually the second person among those who ruled the USSR, chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, which was equivalent to the post of the president. And he was the member of the Politburo of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the USSR. Well, actually the work on the spiral was carried out until 1970, literally until the death of Mikoyan, the one that was the head of the design bureau. Almost immediately, the fourth department in Star City was dissolved, and the detachment of space fighters joined the main detachment of cosmonauts. And that seemed to be all at that time. But by that time, Lazino Lozinsky was working hard on a new project, the Buran, and he again decided to take a risk and made an unprecedented decision not to stop working on the spiral. Today we can say for sure, because for the Buran it was necessary to test the thermal insulation protection of several types within the framework of the Cosmos program, starting around the Cosmos 1300 in 1992. So that space, the Bohr craft was launched under the guise of a mock-up of the Buran. It was a full-scale Bohr on which this very thermal insulation was tested. German Titov told Russian journalist, for example, Psalomshikov, Valentin Psalomshikov, well, the guy is in the know, he knows a lot of people and you in the space program. Anyway, this is how he told him what happened. We created a model of the Buran on a scale of 1 to 3 and conducted a series of tests. 4 launches were carried out, 3 successful and 1 emergency. They forgot to attach a parachute to the device. We managed to hide the first launch from the Americans, but at the second launch they recorded everything: how the vehicle landed in the ocean, how it was lifted on board the ship, how the remaining fuel was drained. Based on these photos, they made a mock-up of the device and tested it in their laboratories. The resulting aerodynamic characteristics were significantly better than those of the American shuttle. It can be argued that in order not to endanger Lazino Lozinsky, German Titov presented the official version, but then he misspoke that the aerodynamics of the layout of the Buran turned out to be better than that of the shuttle. But the Buran and the shuttle are twin brothers, and a layman can't tell them apart by their appearance. This, of course, was about the Bohr. German Stepanovich Titov probably did not imagine that a secret American picture would one day get to the internet, and thousands of people would see the one-stop secret bore on the deck of a Soviet ship. And as you can immediately see, this device could not be a model of the Buran in any way. It has a fundamentally different shape and aerodynamics, where the lift is created only at the expense of the fuselage of a specific profile. It is worth restoring historical justice along the way. The name of the strictly classified Lozino Lozinsky was in the shadows in the USSR for a long time, and all the laurels for the creation of the energy Buran complex went to the Soviet declassified designer Glushko. Well, his role is certainly great, but in another way. Glushko was engaged only in the Buran carrier, the Energia rocket. In conclusion, it is necessary to clarify the Soviet cosmonauts' kamikaze hoax distributed via the internet. As you can see, the Western media simply do not have all the information. The Soviet space fighter did not have the unsolved problem of returning the cosmonaut to Earth, since all three bore normally landed in the automatic mode. This landing automation was later used on the Buran. The Bohr craft were not originally intended for the destruction of the American shuttles. Since in 1965, the shuttles, they were not even in the imagination of anyone. But only when Gorbachev said that the USSR had an answer to Reagan's Star Wars program did he mean a semi-legally manufactured and tested space fighter. This was confirmed by the Americans themselves, who told the world that according to their information, the Soviets have a maneuvering spacecraft in orbit that can approach American missile defense satellites and destroy them or knock them out of orbit. The Bohr, by the way, was originally supposed to be equipped with conventional cannon armament, but it turned out to be ineffective when tested in space as part of the Almaz program. In the future, it was supposed to place automatic weapons on it. In the future, by the way, there was also to be the use of the combat lasers on the Bohr. As for the Almaz program, please see my video about Pavel Popovich, his cosmonaut experiences, and his ardent support for Soviet UFO researchers. But as Titov himself notes, the Bohr could also perform purely peaceful tasks of delivering cargo to and from orbit, and much cheaper than existing systems. Well, you know what? It might yet fly again one day. So this is what I wanted to tell you today. Please subscribe. Please tell others about my channel. If you can, please support my research. You will see how in the description to this video. And I'll bring you more fascinating stories about the former Soviet Union and modern post-Soviet countries. Russia, Ukraine, those in Central Asia and so forth. And of course we cannot forget China. So let's stay tuned and thank you for your attention.